The Ethiopian Bible describes the prison beneath the earth, the truth about the abyss. Somewhere in northern Ethiopia, inside a stone chapel that has not changed in 700 years, a Ge'ez manuscript describes a location beneath the earth where beings were not destroyed, only sealed. The text is older than the New Testament. The church that kept it was older than Rome's version of Christianity. And for over 1,600 years, the rest of the world was told this document did not belong in the Bible. The book is called Enoch. The Western world calls it the Book of Enoch, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never removed it. While every other major Christian tradition on earth accepted the Council of Laodicea's decision in 364 CE to ban this text, the Ethiopian Church kept reading it aloud in its liturgy, kept studying it, kept its chapters intact in a language that preserved details the Greek and Latin translations quietly dropped. What those chapters contain is not a vague spiritual allegory about punishment and darkness. What they contain is a physical description, a location with structural details given in the text itself. A sealed chamber with materials Enoch names specifically, walls made of compressed ice, a floor of dark volcanic stone, fire rising from vents in every direction, and a door that has no handle on the outside. The Ge'ez word for what Enoch describes is not a metaphor, it is a noun. A sealed place beneath the water where things are kept, beings who could not simply be destroyed, so they were sealed away instead. In the next several minutes, you will see exactly what the Ethiopian Bible records about that prison, why Babylonian texts written centuries earlier describe the same location using the same language, what Egyptian religious architecture encoded about the space beneath the visible world, and why access to the most complete versions of these manuscripts has been restricted since the 1970s. If this kind of forbidden biblical history is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we go directly to the primary sources, the archived field notes, and the Ge'ez passages that never made it into the version of Scripture the Western Church approved. The Ethiopian Bible is not the same document as the Protestant or Catholic Bible, and this matters before we go further. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes 81 books as canonical scripture. The Protestant, Old and New Testaments together contain 66. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The Ethiopian list includes texts that have never appeared in any Western canon, among them multiple books of Enoch and texts that survive only in Ge'ez. The Ethiopian tradition draws on a Hebrew lineage that predates Roman Christianity by centuries and includes contact with Alexandrian Jewish scholarship that the Roman Church eventually severed. When the Council of Laodicea met in 364 CE and voted to exclude the Book of Enoch from the biblical canon, the Ethiopian Church was not subject to Rome's jurisdiction. It never implemented the ban. The result of this independence is a manuscript tradition that preserved passages no Western scholar saw until the late 18th century. The Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts to Europe in 1773, and the response from Oxford theologians was not curiosity, it was alarm. The sections describing the deep prison were called irreconcilable with Mosaic cosmology. And 1,821 review in a London theological journal called the Ocean Floor Chapters Theologically Problematic. The problem, as it almost always is when ancient texts become uncomfortable, was specificity. Names can be checked, measurements can be tested. Spiritual allegory cannot be falsified, and that is precisely why it's safe to publish. The Book of Enoch, as preserved in Ge'ez, divides its descriptions of imprisoned beings into 2 separate categories. Western readers tend to collapse these into a single concept, fallen angels in hell, but the text does not allow that reading if you work from the Ethiopian manuscripts directly. Chapter 10 describes one category, the watchers imprisoned beneath the Judean desert, held in what Enoch calls temporary detention, awaiting trial at the final judgment. This is the group headed by Azazel, the one who taught humanity weapons and metallurgy, and by Shemiaza, the one who organized the descent to Mount Hermon. Their prison is a holding facility. The text uses the Ge'ez term meshagert, which carries the sense of a place of waiting, a structure designed for temporary occupation before a verdict is rendered. But chapters 17 through 19 describe something different. A second category of imprisoned beings, located not beneath the desert but beneath the ocean, described not in terms of waiting for judgment but in terms of permanent containment. The Ge'ez term used for this second prison is alatala, which does not appear in Western translations because the translators could not find a Greek or Latin equivalent. Its closest modern sense is a sealed place from which nothing is retrieved, a vault rather than a cell. The distinction in the text is deliberate. 2 different prisons, 2 different purposes, 2 different sentences. The architecture of the second prison is the part that stopped scholars. Chapter 18 verse 9 says, Enoch was taken beyond the great sea, and the Ge'ez uses Bahi Abi, the great sea, not a river or inland body of water. He is over the ocean. Verse 7 describes the floor beneath him as dark stone, smooth and cold, unlike any stone found on land. This is basalt, the igneous rock that forms the entire floor of every ocean on Earth. Enoch had no way to know the ocean floor is paved in basalt. The deepest any ancient human could dive was somewhere around 100 feet using breath-hold techniques. The ocean floor averages 2 miles down and reaches nearly 7 miles at its lowest point. Enoch was not a diver. He should not know what the bottom of the ocean is made of. And yet he describes it accurately. Chapter 18 verse 9 continues. Enoch sees columns of fire descending into the dark stone floor, fire that falls downward without end. This is the wrong direction. Fire rises. Every ancient person understood that. But hydrothermal vents, which are underwater volcanic fissures that release superheated water at temperatures reaching 750 degrees Fahrenheit, do not rise and fall the way surface fire does. They shoot upward from the floor in columns. From below, standing on the basalt and looking up, those columns would appear to descend from above. Enoch describes this correctly for the vantage point he claims. He is standing on the ocean floor, looking up at columns of superheated water rising toward the surface. From that angle, they descend from the viewer's sky. What Enoch calls pillars of fire, oceanographers call black smokers. The oldest surviving description of hydrothermal vent activity in human literature may be in a Jez manuscript, locked in a chapel in Axum. The text does not explain the mechanism. Enoch is not teaching geology. He is recording what he observed, the same way a first responder files an incident report, writing what was in front of him without editorializing. Beyond the fire columns is the prison structure itself. Chapter 18 verse 11 says, Enoch saw a great house built from stones of hail and ice. The Ge'ez term, tesebe, appears here, which Dr. Ephraim Isaac, whose 1,983 Oxford translation worked directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts rather than from the Greek, identifies as compressed ice, not surface frost but ice under enormous pressure, the kind that forms in deep-sea geological conditions where temperature and pressure interact in ways ordinary atmosphere cannot produce. The walls of this structure burn with fire. The floor is basalt. The interior is compressed ice. And the door, Enoch writes, has no handle on the outside. The door detail appears only in the Ge'ez manuscripts. It does not appear in the R.H. Charles 1906 English translation, which most Western readers still use as their primary reference. It does not appear in the Millich 1976 scholarly edition that was the first to publish some of the Dead Sea Scroll Enoch fragments. It appears in the Axum manuscripts, the ones that have been physically inaccessible to Western scholars since the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, when the new government classified all church archives as national cultural property. Dr. James Vanderkam, whose 2004 Cambridge study on Enoch remains one of the standard scholarly references in the field, applied for direct access to the Axum manuscripts in 1988. Denied. He applied again in 1997. Denied. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, Vanderkam stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars only through secondary references and have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. One of those passages involves the contents of the prison. Chapter 19 verse 1 identifies what the sealed house contains, and the angel Uriel delivers the identification in direct language. These are the angels who cohabited with women, Uriel says. Their spirits take many forms. They defile men and lead them astray, to offer sacrifices to demons as to gods. But the text does not stop there. The Ge'ez manuscript at Axum, as referenced by Isaac's 1983 translation notes, adds a phrase that Western editions omit. The phrase uses the term mesline, which carries the sense of those whose form has separated from their function, beings whose physical presence is sealed below while their influence continues to move through the world above. The prison contains their bodies. Something else escapes through the door. Chapter 19 verse 3 adds the sentencing language. The Ge'ez says their imprisonment is lem, for ages upon ages. That phrase appears elsewhere in Enoch, only in context describing permanent conditions. Western translations render this as forever and ever, which loses the technical weight of the Ge'ez construction. Liam carries the weight of finality in the Ethiopian textual tradition. Whatever is beneath the ocean floor was not detained to await judgment. It was removed from the world entirely. The oath that keeps the seal in place appears in chapter 69. Verse 14 names a being called Caspiel as the keeper of the seal, the one who revealed the secret oath to the archangel Michael. Verse 15 records the content of the oath, which was sworn before creation. Before the ocean floor existed, before the prison was built, the agreement that the door would remain shut was already in place. Enoch writes this without apparent surprise, as if the chronology is obvious to anyone who understands what the structure is. The prison was not built in response to an emergency. It was designed in advance. The containment of whatever lives beneath the deep ocean was a planned architectural decision made before the world containing that ocean was constructed. The Babylonian textual tradition reaches the same location from a different direction. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts that produce the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle contain a concept that predates both of those texts by centuries, the Abzu. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Abzu is the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, a subterranean deep that existed before the world was formed above it. The god Enki, lord of wisdom and water, rules the Abzu. His domain is beneath the surface of the visible world, but in the oldest layers of Sumerian religious literature. Before the theological systematization that later mythology represents, the Abzu is not a neutral reservoir. It is a place of active containment. The Akkadian term nanasu appears in ritual texts from the Old Babylonian period, meaning to descend into the deep, specifically in contexts where the descent is involuntary and irreversible. Beings nanasu into the Abzu do not return. The verb construction lasha alam, meaning they shall not see the world above again, appears in the same ritual texts alongside the descent formula. The Babylonian Anzu tradition, which describes a being of unusual power who stole the Tablet of Destinies and was eventually subdued by the god Ninurta, places Anzu's ultimate confinement in a location described as beneath the waters that have no shore. That phrase matches the geography of Enoch's second prison almost exactly. Both traditions describe a being of considerable power, not destroyed but confined, placed beneath a body of water with no accessible edge, kept there by a sealed mechanism that no outsider can operate. The Atrahasis epic makes the custodial relationship explicit. When the three great gods divide the cosmos, Anu receives the sky and Enlil receives the surface of the earth. But the Akkadian verb assigned to Enki's acquisition of the Abzu is shala ipakar, custodianship over something that must not be released. He does not own the deep the way Anu owns the sky. He guards it, a keeper appointed to maintain a seal over what is inside. This is the same structural relationship Enoch describes between Caspiel and the sealed house beneath the ocean, appearing in two geographically and linguistically separate traditions with no documented cultural transmission pathway between them. Egypt's contribution to this framework arrives from a different angle. The pyramid texts, the oldest inscribed religious literature in ancient Egypt, dating in their carved form to roughly 2400 BCE, contain references to a place the Egyptians called the Duat. The standard Egyptological reading of the Duat describes it as the land of the dead, a spiritual realm through which the sun travels at night and through which the soul moves after death. That reading is supported by extensive New Kingdom elaboration in the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates, but those New Kingdom texts are not the oldest layer. The pyramid text utterances from the Old Kingdom have a different character from the later elaborations. Utterance 254 describes the Duat not as a spiritual realm, but as a physical location beneath the earth, directly below the living world. The Egyptian compound used in this utterance is Akhta, the luminous under-earth, which carries both brightness and below-ground in the same construction. That combination does not describe a metaphysical realm of death. It describes a place underground and lit from within, fire beneath the surface without sunlight. Utterance 690 of the same corpus describes the Duat as containing beings sealed there before the creation of the gods themselves. The Egyptian term for these beings is Netjeru and Ak, the shining ones of the under-earth, and the text distinguishes them carefully from ordinary divine beings. They have a different origin. They were not created in the same sequence as the other gods. They pre-exist that sequence and were placed below before the ordering of the world above was completed. The pyramid text does not explain why. It records the placement and moves on. The Edfu building texts, which Dr. Eve Raymond's 1969 study identified as preserving material from a far older oral tradition, describe the space beneath the primordial water that persisted after the first mound rose above it. The Edfu text calls this space the domain of the covered ones. The Egyptian grammatical construction is passive. These beings were covered, hidden, placed under concealment by higher agency. They did not choose to be beneath the water. In each of these traditions, Egypt, Babylon, and Ethiopia, The deep beneath the water is a containment system, created by a higher power for beings that could not be integrated into the world above. The prison was not their home, it was their sentence. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947 added an Aramaic layer to the Ge'ez evidence. 11 copies of the Book of Enoch were found in those caves, more copies than were recovered of Deuteronomy or Exodus. Fragment 4, Q. 206, stored at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from chapter 17, dated by carbon analysis to approximately 100 BCE. This predates the Ge'ez manuscripts by centuries and confirms that the ocean floor passage was not a late addition invented by the Ethiopian tradition. It was in the text from the earliest recoverable written layer. But the Aramaic fragments are incomplete. Scholars who worked on the Qumran publication project, coordinated by the École Biblique in Jerusalem, organized the scroll fragments into publication priority immediately after their discovery in the early 1950s. Legal texts and community rules were published first. Cosmological and geographical content went last. The Enoch fragments describing the ocean prison were assigned to the lowest priority. They sat unpublished for over 30 years. Joseph Millick finally released his edition in 1976, and his commentary describes the ocean floor passage as mythological elaboration without geographical content, with no evidence offered for that assessment. What the full Ge'ez text contains, in the passage Western editions consistently condense, is a phrase Dr. Ephraim Isaac identified in a note archived at the University of Manchester. Chapter 17, verse 8 in the Ge'ez contains the phrase Adar Nafas. Isaac identifies this as the reservoir of breath, not winds in a meteorological sense, which is how the R.H. Charles 1906 edition renders the equivalent verse, the reservoir of breath, something stored below the ocean floor that is still breathing. That phrase, Adar Nafas, appears one other time in the Book of Enoch as preserved in Ge'ez. Chapter 61, verse 5, uses the identical construction to describe the breath of the righteous dead being preserved until resurrection. Same word, same grammatical structure, two different contexts. In chapter 61, breath is held in storage for souls awaiting resurrection. In chapter 17, the same construction describes whatever is sealed beneath the ocean floor. Enoch used resurrection language to describe the contents of a deep-sea prison because the contents are not dead. They are preserved, suspended, contained in something the Ethiopian manuscripts call a reservoir, and the Western editions silently removed. The institutional history of that removal tracks through a specific sequence. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE excluded Enoch from the biblical canon, citing danger as the stated reason. Canon 60 of that council prohibits texts that name the angels held in punishment and describe the places of their binding. The Church accepted a spiritual hell without coordinates. It could not accept a measurable, locatable prison beneath the ocean floor with a specific geological composition and specific named contents. One is theology. The other is a testable claim. Testable claims carry consequences that theology does not. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the ocean chapters as confused accounts of creation. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued the ocean abyss passages were borrowed from pagan sea mythology. Neither man addressed the geological specificity. Neither explained how an ancient Judean writer knew the ocean floor was made of dark, smooth stone. Both delivered institutional dismissal, dressed as scholarly assessment. Neither addressed what actually made the text dangerous, which was not the theology, but the precision. The Ethiopian Church, operating outside Rome's authority, kept every chapter intact. And the problem Oxford scholars identified when James Bruce brought the manuscripts to Europe in 1773 is the same problem no institution has formally resolved since. Enoch describes basalt. The ocean floor is basalt. He describes columns of superheated water rising from fissures in that floor. Those fissures exist. He should not know any of this. Modern deep ocean research has documented living organisms sealed beneath layers of sediment in the most geologically stable and isolated regions on Earth. The South Pacific Gyre contains microbial communities living inside sediment cores, far below the sediment surface. These organisms metabolize at rates so slow that classifying them as active life presents genuine scientific difficulty. They consume almost no energy. They do not grow in any measurable way across human timescales. They are suspended in a state that is not death and not life in any ordinary sense. They breathe at a rate too slow to count. They persist. A 2019 Norwegian research survey in the South Atlantic detected acoustic signatures at a depth of 4 miles that the ship's instruments could not classify. The lead researcher filed a preliminary report with the Norwegian Research Council describing the signals as inconsistent with known geological or biological sources at that depth. The full report was classified as a restricted internal document. A summary appeared publicly in 2021 with the acoustic data section redacted. 2 formal requests under Norwegian Freedom of Information law to access the unredacted report were declined without explanation. The Axum manuscripts remain physically inaccessible. The Giez passages that Western scholars know, only through secondary references, have not been available for direct examination since 1974. Fragment 4, Q206, sits in a vault in Jerusalem. The South Pacific sediment cores are cataloged in a laboratory in Japan. The Norwegian acoustic data sits in a redacted file in Oslo. And in a text the Western Church removed from the Bible over 1,600 years ago, a man named Enoch describes standing on the floor of the ocean, brought there by an angel, shown a sealed structure in the dark basalt, told not to touch the door, and given a phrase that the Ethiopian Church preserved and the Western editions removed: the reservoir of breath. What the Ethiopian Bible records about the abyss is not a theological hypothesis or a symbolic rendering of divine punishment. The prison is described with the specificity of an inspection report. The floor material is named. The wall construction is described in terms of its physical properties. The fire columns are placed in relation to the door. The prohibition against contact is issued as a standing order. The sentence is distinguished from the sentence of a different category of imprisoned beings held elsewhere. The name of the keeper is given. The phrase used for the contents describes beings whose breath is being held in storage. None of this is the vocabulary of mythology. Mythology gives you shadow and the river of the dead. It does not give you the geological composition of the floor or tell you the door cannot be opened from outside. It does not use resurrection language to describe the respiratory state of whatever is sealed inside. The Ethiopian Church preserved this text for 1,600 years after the rest of the world was told to abandon it, not because its theology was unusual, but because its claims were too specific to dismiss without consequences. The church at Axum kept the Giez term Alatala, the sealed place from which nothing returns. It kept Tessebe for the compressed ice, Meslene for the beings whose form separated from their function, and Adar Nafas, the reservoir of breath. The 2 words the Western editions converted to a treasury of winds and hoped no one would compare to the originals. The sealed house beneath the Great Sea is still there in the text exactly as Enoch recorded it. The door with no outside handle is still described exactly as the angel showed it to him. And in the stone chapels at Axum, in cedar boxes behind walls that have been standing for 7 centuries, the Giez manuscripts that preserve the most complete version of that description remain inaccessible. Restricted. Breathing, you could say, in exactly the way the text itself says the things inside the prison breathe. Slowly, quietly, waiting for the moment that has not yet arrived.